right, so I don't see anybody else coming in, so we'll get started here. So for our Zoom webinar this month, we'll be talking about flight reviews. Kind of a complex topic a lot of people discuss, but we'll be breaking this apart later and taking a look at the ground session mainly. But I think everybody already knows me here, but I'll just give a little introduction because this will be recorded later. My name is Wesley Chin. I'm a CFI at Princeton Flying School. I've been teaching here for about a year and a half, since October 2020. And I also did all my ratings at Princeton from private through CFI. When I'm not teaching at the airport, though, I'm currently still a student studying finance at the Rutgers Business School. Let me also turn my camera on here. That'll be a good idea. All right, very good. So in terms of the content for today, we'll be starting off by talking about the structure of a flight review. So what goes on in it, what do we ask? Then we'll actually take a in-depth look at the ground session, because the flight review actually starts with ground. So we'll take a look at the big concepts that we'll be talking about, and then some additional considerations, tips and tricks at the end. So we'll get started here with all about flight reviews. All right, so what exactly is a flight review? So it's the FAA's way of making sure you can still safely fly an airplane after you get a certificate or a new rating, right? So unlike when you get your driver's license, you take your test and you get it, and all right, you can drive a car, no problem. It's a little bit different with when you get a pilot license. So the FAA says that you cannot actually act as pilot in command, PIC, unless you complete a flight review within the last 24 calendar months. That's the regulation there. Can't act as PIC if you're not completing that flight review in the last 24 calendar months. The flight review is conducted by a certified flight instructor, and it's a minimum of 1 hour of ground training and a minimum of 1 hour of flight activity. So that's the keyword, is minimum there. It's up to the CFI actually to determine how much time is needed, especially if someone's a little rusty or wants to spend more time focusing on something else, that will become more than an hour. But again, legally, it is a 1 hour minimum for each ground in the flight there. The biggest thing that I'm going to stress throughout the presentation is that a flight review is not a test, or it's not a check ride. It's basically where you're being evaluated, and we're also providing any additional training if necessary. There's no pass or fail with the flight review. We'll talk about that after. But the biggest thing is you shouldn't really be stressing about it too much, since it's not a check ride or any kind of test. Some other things about flight reviews over here. So you've actually got to complete a flight review in an aircraft for which you're rated in. Hopefully that's common sense. But for example, if you get a private pilot airplane single engine land, you hold that certificate, you've got to complete your flight review in an airplane single engine land. So if you've been training in 172s, you're flying that, and you're not rated in a multi-engine airplane, you can't obviously take your flight review in that. But if you do hold multiple ratings, let's say maybe you hold private pilot airplane single engine lander, and you also hold airplane single engine C, you can do that flight review in any of those aircraft, and you'll be able to act as PIC in anything else you're rated in. So you don't have to actually complete a separate flight review for every aircraft other than that. And the other thing which I touched on before we're here, the CFI is going to tailor that ground review and the flight activities to your kind of experience. So we'll be talking about what kind of type of flying you do, how many hours do you have, how often do you fly, all beforehand, so that we make sure that the flight review is pretty comprehensive and addresses any weaknesses or anything that you want to talk about as well. So in the ground review, this first statement here comes directly from an FAA publication we'll be taking a look at later, but the objective as the ground review is to ensure that the pilot can comply with all regulatory requirements and operate safely in various types of airspace under an appropriate range of weather conditions. Kind of a long sentence, but again, they're just saying, can you still safely fly an airplane and not just clear skies, for example. So what we'll be doing in that first portion of the ground is kind of structuring it using the PAVE acronym. If you guys don't remember, that's what we use for risk management. 4 different categories to perceive hazards in. That's pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures. So that's PAVE. There's a couple of different things within each category we're looking at. For example, in environment, we spend a lot of time talking about airspace or weather, and an aircraft will be talking about airworthiness or inspections and maintenance, that kind of stuff. Sometimes we'll also give like a cross-country flight plan if that's something that the pilot would be interested in doing or has a lot of experience. But again, the key word is it's a ground review. Definitely coming, knowing as much as possible. We'll talk about where to find the information, but it is a review and not a check ride. After the ground, though, we would have a flight time. So the flight activities, we're basically reviewing anything that's necessary for you to perform to demonstrate that you can safely exercise the privileges of your certificate. So we're likely not going to do every single maneuver that you would find in a check ride, but you should still try your best and be able to perform maneuvers to ACS or PTS standards. But legally, at a minimum, we do have to cover the following things here. Definitely expect takeoff and stabilize approaches to landings, slow flight, stall recognition, stalls, and also stall recoveries, obviously. We're not going to do spins in the airplane, but we'll talk about spin recognition and avoidance. And there will be some instrument flight and recoveries from unusual attitudes. So at a minimum, expect those, but we'll also maybe do some other things after that. We'll talk about where to find that later. So again, the biggest thing here, still kind of repeating the point, the role of the CFI during the flight review is to provide an evaluation, at least for the flight here. But we can also provide training or instruction on areas that are deficient. So again, you do want to try your best to get those maneuvers and everything up to PTS or ACS standards, but it's okay if some of them aren't. If you know, for example, maybe your slow flight, you're struggling a little bit holding the altitude and airspeed control is not perfect, we'll help you out a little bit. We'll provide some training and talk about how you can control airspeed with pitch, for example, and power for altitude. And if that corrects it, great. So again, this doesn't mean your flight review outcome is not satisfactory if we have to help you out to provide training. That's totally okay, as long as that additional instruction will correct deficiencies. So 2 outcomes basically of a flight review. It was kind of weird wording this, but again, I'll mention this later. So obviously you're looking for a satisfactory completion over here. So if you can pass your flight review, it's all good. The instructor thinks you're good to fly. We'll provide you with a logbook endorsement. That logbook endorsement will allow you to now act as PIC again, and you have another 24 calendar months until you have to do another flight review. There are certain things that you can substitute it with, and we'll talk about that later. But let's say that the performance during the flight review wasn't too great. The additional training didn't help so much. We weren't able to get everything, especially with maybe the ground or the flight together. There is not a fail. And again, with the flight review, you're not going to fail a flight review. Instead, what we'll do is just log the flight as dual instruction. So, just another line in the logbook will log, whatever maneuvers we did, and that's it. There's no fail or no, endorsement for a fail. But afterwards, we'll discuss a course of action, which will probably consist of some kind of additional ground or flight training so that you can eventually, accomplish a satisfactory flight review, working towards that, basically. So again, there's no pass or fail with this flight review. If you do good, satisfactory completion, we get your logbook endorsement, but if not, it's just going to be dual instruction there. So if you want more insight on flight reviews, I would definitely highly suggest taking a look at this document. This is an advisory circular 6198. They're on edition D right now, published by the FAA. It's called Currency Requirements and Guidance for the Flight Review in IPC. Obviously, we're not talking about IPCs right now, so it's just flight reviews. But this is what we as a CFIs use actually in conducting flight reviews in terms of what we have to ask on the ground and in the airplane. So this will give you a lot of good information of what to expect when you're doing a flight review. So we'll just take a look at it actually right now. So let me open that up. So I will skip the first couple chapters, but chapter 4 over here is all about the flight review. So they talk about the intent and structure, any considerations pre-review, planning and recording the review, any post-review considerations. But at the end, this is where we actually spend most of the time looking at. They have a lot of different resources here. One of them is the sample flight review checklist and a regulatory review guide, which would be what we would cover on the ground over here. So just to kind of take a look at this. Appendix E, regulatory review guide, actually tells us exactly what we have to talk about in that ground review section. They even give you all of the regulations to look up the information for, what you're responsible for knowing. So obviously this is the right place to be looking for when you're preparing for a flight review and know what to expect. So what we'll be doing for the next portion of the presentation is actually taking a look at that ground review stuff that we just saw in the appendix. So going back to that, it was structured in terms of PAVE, which is our risk management elements. So let's take a look at that starting now. All right, so the first element of PAVE is pilot. And the first thing they have us talk about is experience over here. And let me just again show you guys where this is. So we're taking a look again at the advisory circular ground review right here. I'm on page 44. And again, structured in PAVE, we're starting with pilot and taking a look at the experience section. So if you guys want to follow along and have this open, or also the regulations, that'll be good. But it's going to be a pretty concise run through of all the information. Obviously, I can't fit everything into an hour, but we'll be taking a look at the main important parts, especially when it gets to airspace. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about all the different types of airspace. It'll just be a nice kind of quick review there. All right, so we'll get back to the slides over here. So starting with pilot experience. So recent flight experience, hopefully that we know this by now, that to act as PIC, got to have a flight review done every 24 calendar months. So that's the main form of currency, but carrying passengers is something that's a little bit different. You have to do something extra if you want to carry passengers. So if you want to carry passengers in the daytime, you've got to do your 3 takeoffs and landings in the same category and class in the preceding 90 days. So category and class, that's airplane, and the class could be single engine land. So you could do your takeoffs and landings in a 172, even if you're flying a Cherokee, for example. They're both airplane, single engine land legally. That's what you're looking for. But again, in the daytime, if you want to carry passengers, in the last 90 days, you actually have to log 3 takeoffs and landings in the same category and class. Now, if it's at nighttime, it's actually the same requirement, but the landings have to be done to a full stop and done 1 hour after sunset to 1 hour before sunrise. And that's also the same period for the night that we're describing here. So if you want to carry passengers at that period and night here, you've actually got to do those 3 takeoff and landings to a full stop. So it can't be touch and go. Daytime, you can do touch and go. And let's quick 0.3 or 0.4 in the pattern, but nighttime, it's got to be to a full stop over there. So one of the main things that you're responsible for as a pilot as well is pre-flight actions. There's a lot of things you should be doing before hopping in an airplane to go fly, obviously. So 91-103 is the regulation for the FAA describing pre-flight actions, but there's a good acronym that I use and teach. It's NW craft over here. So every time before you're flying, at least somewhere else besides your airport, you've got to be checking the following things. So that's NOTAMs, weather reports and forecasts, known ATC delays, runway lengths of intended use, alternatives available, fuel requirements, and takeoff and landing distances. So that's NW craft. That's your acronym for pre-flight actions. Obviously, the best way to hit this, and we'll talk about this later, is conducting a weather briefing and then doing your calculations by hand later, but we'll take a look at that later. But just for now, remember that you do have responsibility before flying an airplane to check NOTAMs. You don't want to be heading into a pop-up TFR, checking the weather and whatnot there. So NW craft. All right, so going to the cautions portion of the pilot element. Fitness for flight, another really big thing that hopefully we all know about. You should be conducting a personal self-assessment every time before you're flying as well. The way the FAA words it is, you want to be physically and mentally safe to fly and not being impaired by I am safe. So I am safe, hopefully you guys know that acronym here. So different elements you want to check is illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and sometimes there's 2 E's, that's emotion and eating. So all these different categories you actually want to assess before you go fly. So you're making sure you're not sick. Medications, if you're taking any, you make sure they're approved by the FAA and they don't have any side effects. Any stress, alcohol, we have those regulations. That's 8 hours bottle or throttle, but obviously better to give at least 24 there and no more than 0.04% BAC. Making sure well rested, you eat and all that stuff, feeling okay. So I am safe is pretty important there as well. All right, so going on to the aircraft portion. So let me just hop back to the advisory circular. So took a look at the pilot and stuff already. There's definitely some things I left out, but those are the big key points. But we're going to talk about the aircraft, and we'll start off with airworthiness first. So required documents on board an aircraft. We have an acronym for this too. I know it's going to seem like I have a lot of different acronyms to run through, but I'm going to put all this stuff together on like a Word document, and it will be attached to the presentation, uploaded later on. But the required documents on board an aircraft we need to fly is AERO. So that's our acronym here, AERO. It's the Airworthiness Certificate, Registration Certificate, Radio Station License, Operating Limitations, and Weight and Balance Data. Again, I know this is a pretty brief and concise overview of this stuff, but I have done separate presentations of all the topics here in the past if you want to learn a lot more. But the airworthiness certificate, right, that's issued when the airplane is manufactured, it says all good to go, and it'll remain valid as long as you keep that airplane in airworthy condition. Registration, though, is a little different. This expires every 3 years. Radio station license, you only need that if you're flying internationally. The airplane will need it, and you will also need that, but we'll skip that since we're not taking, for example, 2 Fox Whiskey overseas. But the last 2 items here, your operating limitations and weight and balance data, are found in your AFM or the POH, which is specific to the aircraft, not something you can just buy online to learn more about the airplane there. All right, so here's the big one, big acronym. I'm not gonna spend time talking about each individual thing here, but required equipment and instruments for day VFR and night VFR. So that's 91205. So we have an acronym for both of those things, of course. So day VFR required equipment is A tomato flames. And then for night VFR, it's all of that plus flaps, A tomato flames for day, flaps for nighttime over here. So we'll go over that. So in daytime with VFR, we need an altimeter, you need a tack for each engine. So obviously if you're flying a 172, there's only gonna be one tack. You need an oil pressure gauge. If you have constant speed propeller, you also would have manifold pressure gauge, a working airspeed indicator, temperature gauge only if you have a liquid cooled engine, but we've got air cooled here. You would also need an oil temp gauge, fuel gauges, even though they're not most accurate all the time. If you have retractable landing gear, you'd also need a landing gear position indicator, anti-collision light system, so that's beacon and strobe, magnetic compass, ELT if it's required. There's specific regulations for that, but you also would need safety belts. So that's A tomato flames here. But for nighttime, it's everything we just talked about plus these 5 additional things, and that's your FLAPS acronym. So F would be fuses. We don't need that, however, because we have circuit breakers. We can just reset those by pushing them in. L is your landing lights. The weird thing is the regulation says you only need your landing lights for hire. So technically, if you have your own airplane and you want to fly at night just for sightseeing purposes by yourself, and you realize that during your pre-flight your landing light is inoperative, you can still legally go fly the airplane. Is that the best idea? Probably not, but again, the regulation is you only need a landing light for hire there. Again, the anti-collision light system appears just because it's actually for airplanes certified, I think it's before March 11, 1996, they don't need it at daytime. P would be position lights. We call those navigation lights in the 172 here. So that's your red on the left, green on the right, and white on the back. And you would also need a source of electricity to power everything in your airplane. So that would be a generator or alternator there. So those are your 2 acronyms for the required equipment and instruments. All right, so moving on from airworthiness, we're going to go into maintenance now. So again, there's a big acronym we'll talk about in here as well. But a couple key things to understand beforehand. So it is the owner and operator responsibility to maintain the aircraft in airworthy conditions. So if you're going to rent an airplane for a flight school and you're doing your pre-flight and find something's wrong, you're obviously not the one responsible for putting in maintenance and doing all the work. It's the owner or operator responsible for doing that. But you as a PIC, you are responsible for determining whether the aircraft is in condition for safe flight. So that means doing your pre-flight and making sure the aircraft still conforms to its airworthiness certificate, basically. Operations after maintenance, though, this is a big one. If the aircraft has had any kind of major alterations that could substantially affect its operation in flight, there is something you have to do before you carry passengers. So before carrying passengers, at least a private pilot must fly that aircraft and make an actual check of the maintenance that was done, make sure it's good, and then after that, log it in the aircraft records. So it does take some time to do that, but again, any kind of major alterations done, you have to have that private pilot flying and testing the equipment still. Preventative maintenance is something else here. So certain kind of things you actually don't need a certified mechanic to do. These are very simple or minor repair operations that can be done by any certificated pilots. So that means private pilot and above. A student pilot cannot do preventative maintenance over here. There's actually a whole list of, I don't remember the numbers, 30 something or 20 something items that count as preventive maintenance. You can check them in the regs, but a couple ones over here, replacing safety belts or replacing or cleaning spark plugs. Those are pretty basic things, but anyone who is doing maintenance has to log it over here. When you are doing your maintenance, you've got to record the description of the work performed, the date of completion, and also your signature and certificate number. All right, and your required inspection is probably an acronym you've learned in the past and pretty important. So we use aviated as our acronym for any required inspections that have to be done. So we're gonna, again, quickly run through this. I did a separate presentation breaking each one of these down in more detail. But starting with the A, we have the annual inspection. This is done every 12 calendar months, hopefully as you can tell by the name. And it's a little special because it has to be done by a mechanic with an IA, an inspection authorization. So if you go take a look at the logs and you find the last annual, you should see that at the end of these signature and certificate number for the mechanic, it should say IA, special training there. V is your VOR check of the equipment in the airplane. This has to be done every 30 days, but it's actually for IFR only. So if you're flying only VFR, maybe you're taking 9 Whiskey Romeo, you're probably not going to find that VOR check being done there. 100-hour inspection. Not every aircraft has to undergo 100-hour here. Only aircraft being used to carry passengers for hire or for flight instruction have to get 100 hours. So Mike, Charlie, Romeo, Mike, all those are obviously, again, 100-hour inspections. The difference between that and an annual is, again, who can do it. Any mechanic can do the 100-hour, but again, it's a mechanic with an IA that has to do the annual there every 12 calendar months. The next A we have here is the altimeter, or the pitot-static system inspection. This one's actually IFR only as well. It's done every 24 calendar months. However, we still do it because it's usually done at the same time where they check the transponder. We talked about transponder, but going to the ELT, emergency locator transmitter. It's a little bit confusing, but there's kind of two parts of this. So first part is you've got to inspect the ELT every 12 calendar months. Nice and easy. Second part, though, the batteries actually have to be replaced under two conditions. So you've got to replace your ELT batteries after 1 hour of cumulative use, or if half the useful life has expired. I don't know why they just make it the useful life, the real number, but that's just whatever the regulation is there. And lastly, airworthiness directives, right? If you don't know what that is, those are notices sent by the FAA. All regulatory information, maybe something is wrong with an airplane that they immediately have to address. So they'll send them out. Sometimes they're pretty urgent. Can't fly until it's fixed, or they'll give you like a certain time span until it has to be fixed. But we're required to keep like a compliance record of all the airworthiness directives in the logs as well. So those are your required inspections abbreviated there. So I know a lot of acronyms, but I'll provide a sheet later on. So going into environment, so the third part of your PAVE acronym, even though it doesn't start with a V, we have airports. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about airports. I'm not going to spend too much time with this, but the first thing they bring up is airport markings. If you wanted to read more and learn more about that, that's in Chapter 2, Section 3 of the AIM, but this is a nice little diagram I found of the main ones that you usually see. I'm not going to go over every single one, but hopefully we know on the top right over here, that's your hold short line, or they call it the runway safety area. That's dividing your taxiway and the runway. Remember, you cannot cross the solid side without a clearance. That's when you're on a taxiway there. You've got your taxiway direction signs, which have a yellow background, versus a taxiway location sign have a black background. Something you may not know too much about on the bottom left here, runway distance remaining. So you'll see those actually on a runway as you're taking off or landing there. That actually will tell you how much runway you have left in 1,000 feet increments. So if I see that 4 there, I know I've got 4,000 feet of runway left available for either takeoff or landing, whatever I'm doing there. Two other big ones I want to talk about that weren't on that little diagram. One of them is the displaced threshold. We do have a displaced threshold. It's on the 2-8 side. We don't have one on 1-0, but there is one for 2-8 just because we have those buildings on the side there. All right, so getting back to the enhanced taxiway center line, I don't know how much that cut off again, but you're probably, again, used to seeing just the yellow line, but sometimes you'll see this at a tower at airport. That tells us you're approaching a runway hold short. You're actually just getting closer to a runway within 150 feet. So if you're taxiing and you start to see these enhanced taxiway center lines under your nose, that should be a cue that you're approaching a runway, and you should think to yourself, have I been cleared to cross, or should I be holding short there? Which brings me to this point. It's not directly within one of these portions in the ground review, but something to bring up that they tell us to, is runway incursions, runway incursion avoidance, basically. So what is a runway incursion? It's basically when you have something on the runway that's not supposed to be there, whether that's another airplane or someone, I don't know, just riding a bike up and down, whatever it is, something that's not supposed to be there. So a lot of ways at least you can prevent a runway incursion yourself. One thing that's pretty obvious is read back all of your runway crossing and hold short instructions. So legal requirement there. And of course, if you're going to a tower airport, review those airport diagrams beforehand and also look for your hotspots. You always know where you are. So hotspots are areas in the past where they've noticed maybe it's a little bit of a confusing intersection, or there's been a lot of runway incursions there or whatever. And they'll actually label it on the airport diagram with a little circle. If you check the chart supplement, there's a hotspot, like kind of directory or list for each airport, and it'll even describe what the location is and why it's confusing. So definitely, if you see a hotspot along your taxi route, brief that beforehand. Another big one here that I'm sure all of us are a little guilty of sometimes, no heads down activities when the aircraft is moving or you're taxiing. It's very tempting as you're just taxiing straight down on Alpha to 28, you know, put your radio frequencies in on the GPS or set up your foreflight or whatever that is. Try not to do that. Make sure your aircraft is fully stopped before you program your GPS, avionics, or anything that's heads down there. Something I'll teach and I'll also do myself is write down any taxi instructions. Sometimes they're pretty long and it's kind of hard to remember after you read it back, because it'll fade, after your short-term memory in like 30 seconds. So as the controller is telling me my taxi instruction, I'm anticipating it first of all. I have my pen ready and my notepad, I'm jotting it down. I'm not spelling out the word Charlie or Delta. I'm just writing C and D, develop whatever shorthand you want, but you do want to try your best to write down those instructions and also even draw it out on your diagram to know where you are. But if you're ever a little bit confused or unsure of that route, even ATC will probably be a little bit annoyed, but you can request what we call progressive taxi instructions. So there, they will actually guide you as you taxi. They'll tell you when to turn left, when to turn right. Again, a little more workload for them, but could help you with your safety. So probably the biggest thing I want to mention here, and biggest pet peeve as CFI, we're going to be talking about traffic patterns here a little bit. So the reason why we have traffic patterns, it's our standardized way to get in and get out of an airport, both at non-towered and towered over here. Standard direction of your traffic pattern is to the left, so we usually make our turns to the left, but some airports have patterns to the right side, and you can actually see that on a sectional chart. It could say RP24. If you go take a look at Old Bridge 3N6, you'll see that. Or if you go take a look at Trenton Robbinsville in November 87, you'll see RP29, which indicates for runway 29, they fly a right traffic pattern instead. Something a little bit weird here about Princeton, we have star RP. So it means right pattern with some kind of limitations. That means check the chart supplement for more information. So if you actually go take a look there, you'll see that it's right traffic for helicopters on both runways. Fixed wing, we will still fly left traffic there. Your standard traffic pattern altitude is 1,000 feet AGL, or above ground level. So if my elevation was 118, for example, I think that's Robbinsville, my traffic pattern standard altitude would be 1118 ms. So I'm just adding 1,000 on top of the elevation. However, that's not always the case. You would, again, check your chart supplement to figure out what the actual traffic pattern altitude is. Usually you'll say that in your airport remarks. So on the bottom over here, I've got a little picture or screenshot from the chart supplement. I think that was Penridge. I've got to take a look again. But their elevation is, I think it was 568, but on the bottom, the pattern says pattern for light aircraft is 1368, and that's actually 800 feet AGL. So sometimes it is non-standard, so you do want to check that beforehand. Obviously, make your radio calls in the pattern as well in each key point. So I've got a little diagram on the bottom right. We've got your departure, crosswind, downwind, base, and final legs that you all want to make calls on. Something else that I want to bring up, departure versus upwind. These are two different legs. They're not the same thing, even though a lot of times you'll hear people call, for instance, traffic, 2 Fox Whiskey on the go, 28 on the upwind, or something of that sort. You're not actually on the upwind. You're on the departure leg. So the upwind leg is parallel to your runway, but it's actually on the other side of the pattern. So likely you would find an airplane doing a go around on the upwind leg. However, if you're just taking off and you're just maintaining your runway center line still up until 900 before you turn crosswind, that's your departure leg. So try your best to differentiate between those two terms. Be aware that people don't know the difference, and that sometimes people will say they're on the upwind when they're actually really on the departure leg. So I'm not going to talk about how to fly the pattern. It's obviously going to vary for each aircraft. I did another presentation a while ago on that. But biggest thing here we're going to talk about, entering a pattern, entering the pattern. This is going to be for non-towered. Of course, at towered airports, they'll tell you directly what they want you to do. But at a non-towered airport, the 45 to midfield downwind is the safest method for pattern entries. So there's a diagram we're going to take a look at on the bottom here. On the left side, it says preferred entry when crossing over midfield. So you've got to join 45 to downwind somehow. If I'm already on the side of the pattern, I can just maneuver myself to join 45. Maybe I was coming over here. But let's say I'm on the opposite side of the pattern. So for example, let's say Princeton's on 28 over here. I'm coming from the north practice area. I want to go back and land. The downwind is to the south of the runway. So I've got to somehow get to the 45. So let's kind of walk through the steps over here. So number one, it says cross the field at pattern altitude plus 500 feet. You can also cross 1,000 feet above, which is what I'll do just to provide an even higher buffer between any aircraft below me. So again, so I'm crossing the field in the middle, perpendicular to the runway, 1,000 feet above pattern altitude. After doing that, I'm just going to still fly straight and hold my altitude. I do not want to descend yet. I do not want to turn yet. It says fly clear of the traffic pattern, approximately 2 miles. So you're giving yourself a good amount of time. You're not just waiting 5 seconds and then making a sharp turn into the 45 to join downwind yet. You want to get clear of the pattern, get clear of anyone on downwind, and once you're at least 2 miles out, then you can start that descending right turn into the pattern to join 45 midfield downwind there. So the whole goal is, again, you're clearing the pattern first before descending and turning. The last thing it says, so yield to downwind traffic, and then you enter. So the people in the pattern have the right of way. If you are starting that turn with 45 and you see someone there on crosswind turning downwind, you to them. So you've actually got to do another 360 and come back in on the 45 if you're able to. So you're trying not to cut anybody off. Again, the whole point of this entry is that you can look for traffic when you're on 45 before you turn the downwind. Be aware that not everybody does this though, even though this is the safest method. A lot of people will do this on the right side, alternate midfield entry. They'll just cross midfield at pattern altitude and cut directly into the downwind with the left turn. Can you do it? Yeah, I mean, none of this is a legal requirement, but it's obviously not the safest thing to do when you have multiple guys in the pattern. If there's absolutely no one there, okay, could be a good idea, but anytime there's traffic and you know, anytime overall, the 45 downwind entry is the safest method. All right, so going into airspace, we'll spend some time talking about this as well. So cruising altitudes, there's a rule that we have to use for VFR cruising altitudes anytime we want to fly above 3,000 feet AGL, and it's based on your magnetic course. So that accounts for magnetic variation, and to find that, you would look at your isogonic lines on the sectional. Here it's 12 degrees west. We would add 12 because east is least, west is best. So again, it's based on magnetic course. So course would be what you're flying over the ground, not where your nose is pointed at. So basically, if your magnetic course is between 0 to 179 to the east, you'd be flying odd thousands plus 500. But if you're flying west, that's 180 to 359 magnetic course or track. That would be even thousands plus 500 feet. So for example, I could fly 4,500 from Princeton to Reading. But if I was going Princeton to, going back to speed limits again, so can't exceed 250 knots below 10,000 feet. But you can't exceed 200 knots anytime you're below class Bravo. So for example, if you're within the lateral limits but below it, you can't exceed 200 knots there. You can't exceed 200 also when you get close to a primary class Charlie or Delta airports. That's if you're at or below 2,500 AGL and within 4 nautical miles. Right of way, something else to consider here, a couple of different rules that they have is in 91.113. Hopefully common sense, but an aircraft in distress or an emergency has right of way. But if you have two aircraft converging of the same category, the guy on the right has the right of way there. But if there are different categories, we can just think of least maneuverable to most maneuverable. There's a little acronym here, big R. So like a balloon would have right of way over a glider versus maybe an airship would have right of way over an airplane, but a rotorcraft does not. If you have two guys approaching head on, you would both turn to the right. If you have an aircraft being overtaken, that guy has right of way. And if you have two aircraft on final, the one at the lower altitude would have right of way, but you're also making sure you're not purposely nosediving the aircraft to get lower, so you have right of way as well. All right, and now for a pretty concise overview of the different types of airspace here. So it's organized from class A all the way to G here. So we'll talk about A, and after that from B going to G, it's kind of starting out like we're most restrictive in terms of what you need to do to get in and what kind of goes on there, all the way to G, which is least restrictive and least busy, if you want to call it that. So class A, this extends from 18,000 feet MSL to 60,000, that's flight level 600. That's above the rest, A above the rest. This is IFR only, so you don't have to worry about this if you're just flying VFR. But going to Class B or Class Bravo airspace surrounds the busiest airports in our country. So B for busy. Think maybe JFK, Philly, LaGuardia, Newark. Those are super busy airports. There's tons of airliners. That's Class B airspace. It's the most restrictive. You need a clearance to enter. It's a little special. This is the only kind of airspace where you need a clearance to enter. So you got to request it, and the controller actually has to tell you clear it into the newer Class Bravo airspace. You also have to have your transponder and ADS-B out to enter that. Class Charlie now, so going into Class C. This is less busy than Class Bravo, but still has a pretty solid mix of GA and airline traffic. So you could think of Allentown, Atlantic City, Islip, that's all Class Charlie airspace there. It's busy, but less busy than Bravo. You don't need a clearance, but you still need what we call two-way radio communications and a transponder still to enter in Class Charlie. Going to Class D now, even less restrictive. So even less busy too. Less busy than Class Charlie. It's mostly GA traffic, maybe just a few airline traffic. So you've got Trenton, time flying in. It's controlled airspace, but there's no requirement to communicate if you're VFR. You would still, have your flight following if you wanted to get that. Class C kind of begins at a bunch of different spots along the map. We'll take a look at that later, but your most common form either begins at 700 feet or 1,200 feet above ground level. And the least restrictive here, Class Golf, Class G is your uncontrolled airspace. Uncontrolled airspace. Usually this is from your surface to the base of whatever is on top. So again, just a very brief run through of all your different types of airspace. And now let's take a look at what they look like on your sectional. So on the right here, we've got Class B. This is the solid blue line. So if I'm over here, it would be from 3,000 to kind of think of it as shaving off one of those top layers of the Bravo. You still have that core ring and just another shelf on top. That's all. On the bottom over here in the middle, we've got Trenton. We've got Class D surrounding that, as you can tell with your dashed blue lines. That's just a core ring. So there's no layers on top of the cake. Is just a core ring over here. That's from surface up to 2,700 feet MSL. And now let's take a look at the Class E. The main way we can tell where it starts, you see we have these like fuzzy shadings of the magenta over here. If I'm on the inside of the magenta, the soft side, Class E begins at 700 AGL. But if I'm on the outside of it, the harder side, Class E begins at 1,200 feet AGL. So if I look at where I am at Princeton, right over here, we're on the inside of the shading. So Class E would begin at 700 AGL. And everything below it would be your Class G uncontrolled airspace. One of the most annoying things you have to learn and memorize for your check ride is those VFR weather minimums for each one of those types of airspace. There's a good chart in the airplane flying handbook, or sorry, I should say the PHAC, with the weather minimums and everything. But this guy named Rod Machado also developed this little airspace weather minimums triangle or pyramid you can also use. To learn it this way, just write this thing out like 15 times and you'll have it memorized, I guess. I'm not going to go through every single one, but just to show you how to read it, it's basically telling me if I'm above 10,000 MSL, I'm in E or G airspace. The minimums are 5 statute mile visibility, 1,000 feet above, 1,000 below, and 1 mile away from clouds. But if I was in Class G airspace above 1,200 AGL, but below 10,000 MSL, I would need 1 statute mile visibility, 1,000 above, 500 below, and 2,000 feet from clouds. So however you want to memorize those weather minimums are there, but obviously practically you're just staying clear of clouds. So we went through the kind of standard airspace, if you want to call it like that, but there's also special use airspace that exists on our sectional charts. Why do we have this? Well, there's something weird going on in that airspace that just has to be confined in that area. Whatever it is, they have to mark it there. Your most common types I have listed below, and you need permission to enter 2 of them. That's your prohibited areas and restricted areas. You don't need permission to enter warning areas, military operation areas, or alert areas, but you should still want to exercise extreme caution there. But to find when these guys are active and who you can contact to get permission or more information, it's actually on the bottom of your sectional chart. So if you look on the bottom, you'll see these this kind of chart over here. So for example, restricted area 5001 alpha is only from surface to 4,000 feet. It's only active from 6 a.m. to 11:30 p.m. local. They'll send out a NOTAM 4 hours in advance, and you would contact McGuire on 126.47 for more information, or if you wanted to get cleared through. All right, another big one to bring up, last thing about airspace, TFRs, temporary flight restrictions. Hopefully pretty self-explanatory what that is there, but it's basically restricting aircraft from operating in a certain area, and it's temporary, so it's not permanent there. TFRs are issued by NOTAMs, so that's why you always want to be checking NOTAMs before you're flying. That's part of your weather briefing, pre-flight actions, all that stuff pops up on ForeFlight. A lot of different reasons why they established TFRs. Obviously, we're used to the presidential TFRs, but they will also do them for sporting events, such as over Rutgers, they have the stadium here. But the overall message is check for TFRs before you go flying. All right, so moving on from airspace into air traffic control and procedures. So I'm not going to talk to you guys about how to communicate with ATC and all that. Again, there's a separate presentation where we talked about radio communications. But one thing they have us bring up is services. the main service that hopefully you guys are using, something we call flight following. Flight following, we usually get that from an approach controller. So flight following in essence is traffic advisories. You can also get assistance in emergency situations, any weather updates and vectors as necessary. And again, it's provided by approach control, but it's only on a workload permitting basis for them. So if they're pretty busy, vectoring guys onto approaches, or they just have too much on their plate, they can just tell you that they're not going to give you flight following, VFR services denied, or whatever that's going to be. So it's workload permitting basis for them. Even though it is considered traffic advisories, though, you do get them USPIC, you're still going to be the one who is responsible for seeing and avoiding traffic. So don't entirely rely upon them there. Usually we would talk to approach in the air to get flight following, but when you're departing from a town airport, you can actually pick up flight following to a destination on the ground. You can contact the ground control with a VFR request, and they'll give you a departure frequency and a squawk code for later on. So some key points with radio communications that I've brought up in the past as well. Know what you're going to say before you say it. So don't push the button, say Princeton traffic, 8 Mike Charlie, 10 miles to the, and wait for 10 seconds if you don't know where you are. Figure it out beforehand, because people need to say what they're doing. CTAF if someone's having a conversation. But if you ever have to talk to a controller, on an initial call at least, we use the 4 Ws. That's kind of a little formula for radio communications here. That's whom you're calling, who you are, where you are, and what you want. So maybe if I wanted flight following from Allentown approach to Mount Pocono, I could say Allentown approach, Skyhawk 5338 November, 10 miles northwest of Solberg at 4,500, requesting flight following to Mike Papa Oscar, for example. So I'm talking to Allentown, Iowa's 3 November. I said my location was somewhere northwest of Solberg, and I wanted flight following there. But otherwise, all we do is just read back instructions or key points followed by a call sign, because the air traffic controller doesn't know who's talking unless you actually say your call sign at the end again. So how about if you're talking on a CTAF, like what we do at Princeton? We use that same formula, but we just add whom you're calling again at the end. So if it was Princeton traffic, I say Princeton again at the end. So Princeton traffic, Skyhawk 2 Fox Whiskey is 10 miles north, 3,000, inbound landing runway 28, Princeton. So it's the same thing. I'm just adding whom am I calling again at the end. So when we're talking on a CTAF, though, it's best to always announce your position and intentions when you're 10 miles out inbound to the airport. I also like to do 5 miles, and then any key points in the pattern at a minimum. So if I'm crossing the field, I'll tell them, I'll say that on the CTAF. When I'm joining the pattern, downwind, base final, crosswind, all that stuff you want to be reporting on CTAF. But again, be aware that not everyone does this. It's not a legal requirement to actually make any radio calls at these non-towered airports, so still look outside for traffic. If you're holding short before you take that runway, pivot the airplane a little bit to the right and check for traffic. Make sure no one else is actually on final. Continuing with the ATC stuff. Clearances, I know I brought this up before, but it's very important. You've got to read back any hold short instructions and clearances, whether that's for takeoff, landing, or crossing a runway. And anytime they give you an instruction, you read it back, you're expected to execute those instructions immediately unless they tell you not to. So if you're vacating a runway and they tell you to contact ground, do your checklist first before you contact them, because once they tell you those instructions to taxi or whatever, you're expected to do that right away. Some other key points, I know we brought up NOTAMs before, but it's your job to be responsible and check for NOTAMs for your departure and destination airports before you go flying. You'll see that part of your briefing, of course, but you can do it separately if you want to look on forward flight. If you're opening a flight plan while you're flying, remember that you're responsible for closing it. ATC will not automatically close your flight plan. If you forget to within 30 minutes after your estimated time of arrival, they will then start those search and rescue procedures, which you obviously don't want. So just as a reminder, close your flight plans after you're done. All right, so moving on to weather. Again, there's way too much to talk about weather. So again, we're going to be looking at some key points over here. So let's start off by talking about weather briefings. So whenever you're planning to go flying, you're checking the weather, you can start with the big picture outlook. So seems silly, but you can check weather.com, watch TV, your weather app on your phone. Any of that's okay to see how it's looking so far. But if I see like 100% thunderstorm or whatever the next day, I'm not going to waste my time and continue flight planning and do a further briefing. But if it looks okay, I'll zoom in a little bit more and conduct a weather briefing to get more detailed aeronautical information. Many ways you can do this weather briefing. There's not one way, and all these are good. They're legal. There's no such thing as a legal weather briefing anymore. The FAA recently issued an advisory circular. They were basically telling us, hey, don't call 1-800-WX brief unless you really have to anymore. Use the website. That's also a website where you can file flight plans and do briefings. Aviation Weather Center is the main source for all this stuff. Also, ForeFlight. That's totally okay. Doing a briefing on ForeFlight is completely fine. All the information is from FAA and the government, and it's a great way to do it if you use that EFB. So that's what I'll do personally. 3 different kinds of briefings you can get. Personally, I don't usually do this. I just, again, use ForeFlight for my briefings and update it as necessary if I need to. But you have a standard briefing. Your Outlook briefing, you can get that from flight service if your departure time is more than 6 hours away. And you can also get an abbreviated briefing for specific items closer to your departure time. So maybe you got a standard and you're getting a little closer to departure time within an hour. You can call for an abbreviated briefing. Maybe you just want to ask about TFRs or Metars or whatever it is. You can do that. Some of the products they'll talk about within the weather briefings that you must be checking when you're doing your weather research briefings are your in-flight weather advisories. Those for SIGMETs, convective SIGMETs, and AirMets. So let's talk about each one of these over here. Just, very concise, nothing too wordy here. So SIGMETs are issued whenever you have severe kind of conditions. So it could be severe icing, severe turbulence, something like that. Convective SIGMETs are issued when you have anything bad associated with thunderstorms. Convective means thunderstorms. So squall lines, tornadoes, hail, turbulence associated with thunderstorms. So it's all bad stuff. Going into AirMets though, AirMets are, all right, something kind of bad, but it's not as bad that we have to, issue a SIGMET for it. So again, it's important to pay attention to AirMets, but the weather conditions are not severe enough to require the issuance of a SIGMET there. So it's kind of more of a moderate intensity. There's 3 kinds of AirMets. You've got AirMet Tangos, that's for moderate turbulence. AirMet Sierra is for IFR conditions, and AirMet Zulu is for moderate icing, and they'll also provide your freezing levels there. 2 other products that you should be familiar with, and you will also be checking when you're doing your weather briefings: Metars versus TAFs. These are 2 different things, even though they're very similar to read. But very basically, Metars are current observations and TAFs are forecasts. So observation versus forecast. So your Metar is, again, observation. These are updated hourly unless there's some kind of significant change, versus your TAF is a forecast for the airport area, and they're usually valid for 24 hours. Bigger airports, though, they'll go out for like a forecasting period of 30 hours. A lot of different weather codes they can add within Metars and TAFs, but I'll just run through each one of these here. So this one's for Trenton. It was published on the 9th of the month at 1853 Zulu. It's winds 290 at 11, 3 statute mile visibility, light snow, broken at 300 feet, overcast at 1000. That's all AGL. Temperature -1, dew point -2, and the altimeter is 2986. And going to the TAF on the bottom here, kind of similar to how we read it. This one's also for Trenton. It was published on the 9th of the month again at 2325 Zulu. The forecast period is from 0000 Zulu on the 10th to 2400 Zulu on the 10th. So basically the whole day in that sense. So from that beginning of the forecast period up until 0100, so it's only in an hour there, you're expecting 170 at 6 for the wind, greater than 6 statute miles visibility, few clouds 25,000. But from 0100 Zulu to 1800 Zulu on the 10th, you'll expect 190 at 12 knots, greater than 6 statute miles and scattered at 25,000. And now from 1800 Zulu to the end of the period, which was 2400, you'll expect 220 at 5 for the wind. Still good visibility, but the ceilings have lowered here from scattered to 2500 and broken at 5,000. And last thing with weather over here, wake turbulence. I know it doesn't necessarily relate to weather, but I guess it's grouped together at least in the advisory circular. So the key thing to remember with wake turbulence, it's produced by any aircraft, not just a big jet or 737 in front of you. Just think of that airplane's flight path. Anything below it is bad. That's your wake turbulence. Don't go into it. So if I'm landing behind a big airplane, I want to stay above its flight path and then land after where it touched down. But if I'm taking off behind a larger aircraft, then I'll want to rotate before where he rotated and climb above its flight path so I can stay clear of all that wake turbulence. All right, so that's the end of the environment section, and the last portion would be external pressures for PAVE. So we're going to structure this just based on your 3 Ps risk management process. I know it seems like there's a lot of stuff here, but it'll all make sense. So the way we manage risk, so 3 Ps. First P is perceive hazards. Second one is we process the risk associated with the hazards, and then finally we perform risk management. So again, we're just trying to look for hazards and risks, and then eliminate them. So how do we perceive hazards? We use that PAVE acronym, the same thing we've been talking about the whole time. So pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures. A lot of different things to check for in each one. So in pilot, there could be hazards in fitness to flight. I am safe, right? Qualifications for the flight. If the ceilings are low, you want to make sure you're instrument rated. Are you able to actually file flight plans and all that? Currency versus proficiency, huge topic. You'll be asked about that on your check ride if you haven't done that already, and you should be aware of it. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's safe, and you want to be aware of your own capabilities, and we'll talk about that later on with personal minimums. Going on to aircraft, there could be hazards within airworthiness. So we had all those different acronyms we talked about before for required equipment and inspections and documents. You also want to consider the aircraft's operational capabilities for the flight. Do I have enough fuel for the trip? Can my aircraft actually take off and land on these runways that I intend to? Can I carry the planned load? And you also want to make sure that you're familiar with the aircraft and any avionics that are installed on board. Going to environment, 5 different things to look for risk being weather, airport environment, maybe something's closed, airspace, am I going through any Class B or any special use? Terrain, not really a factor for us here, but pretty important still. And nighttime will have additional hazards and risks to check. External pressures here, this is the biggest one, and it's going to actually appear again later on. This is what will get you. So the biggest thing to talk about, something called get there-itis. This is a desire to satisfy some kind of personal goal. Maybe you have a meeting for work and you've got to fly there and you have to get to that meeting on time so you don't get fired, but the weather is kind of marginal the whole route. Should you go? Obviously not. Also desire to impress someone on board or fear of disappointing a passenger who's coming with you for the first time. All those are huge external pressures that you will face at some time. You want to be aware of those and how they can affect you. So once you perceive those hazards, you want to process to evaluate the level of risk. In other words, why do we care about those hazards? So CARE acronym, that's evaluating the consequences associated with those hazards and risks, any possible alternatives, the reality of the situation. And again, external pressures come again because they're so important. And once you figure out the level of risk associated with those hazards, then you perform your risk management, whether that's mitigating or completely eliminating the risk. And once you do that, you would evaluate the outcome of reactions to make sure that it actually worked. So I brought this up beforehand, personal minimums here. Super important that you do this once you are able to act as PIC. This will help you mitigate the risk that we've all been talking about beforehand and allow you to make safe decisions. They're great because they're unique to your own personal experience level. Everybody will have different personal minimums. Another example here, just because you do your takeoff and landing distance calculations in the POH and it says, I only need 625 feet of runway available to land, doesn't mean you can do it. You're a new private pilot, maybe your short field technique is not the best, whatever, it's just a book. So you always want to add some kind of buffer to that. But fortunately, the FAA does provide us with this personal minimums worksheet that it's very important. Have this, fill this out, keep it with you so you have hard set numbers to follow if you're ever unsure about a decision. Not sure how fast the Wi-Fi is going to load up over here, but it basically works off of that PAVE element again. Let me show you. So in pilot, how many takeoff and landings should I have done in the last how many days? Or in the environment, airport conditions, what's my max crossing component? What runway length do I want? What's my max ceiling visibility, minimum ceiling visibility and all that. So very important that you sit down with your instructor, figure out numbers that are good for yourself and stick with them. All right, so that's my run through of PAVE. So just a couple final things to wrap it up here. All right, so I think the biggest thing that any CFI and even flight schools will see after you get your certificate. It's actually very easy to lose that skill again because you don't end up flying as much compared to when you were training. Because usually what happens when you're working towards your check ride, you're coming to the airport pretty often, working on those maneuvers, making sure they're perfect, and you get a lot of good experience. But once you pass your check ride, there's no need to do that anymore. You got your certificate. So you go back to your family life and your work, and you forget about flying. And 3 months goes by, and you're like, oh my God, I totally forgot what I'm doing now. So what you want to do is, at a minimum, try to fly every 4 to 6 weeks to stay proficient at those maneuvers you're working so hard on. So something that's good to do after you take that check ride and pass, the FAA provides like this sample proficiency practice plan. Maybe every month, go out and practice your stall recoveries, seat turns, ground reference, whatever it is. Do those things just to make sure you can still safely operate your airplane and that you're not just super restricted and can only, I don't know, fly in pattern, for example. So we talked about earlier that the requirement is, okay, to access PIC, you need to do the flight review every 24 calendar months. But there's two things you can actually do that can substitute this. The first one is if you obtain a new certificate. So let's say you have a private, but in 7 months after passing your check ride, you get your instrument. Great. That counts as a flight review now. Now you have 24 months from your instrument check ride date to do that flight review. The second thing, FAA Wings Proficiency Program on FAAsafety.gov. They provide a lot of like online courses and everything, and they all group it together into kind of one phase. And if you complete one phase, you can satisfy that flight review requirement. So a phase would consist of two things. You have knowledge activities, which are those online courses or even live seminars you can attend, and you can choose on what you want to do. And then the second portion of the phase would be flight activities. So you can't just do all of your flight review online. You've got to actually fly with an instructor. But again, you can choose what you want to do. Maybe you want to work on takeoff and landings or ground reference. There's specific tasks. You fly with that instructor, and there's a certain process where the instructor will validate your credits, and then you would actually complete the flight review there. I don't know if you guys noticed or been around long enough, but I've been calling it flight review. A lot of people still call it BFR, biannual flight review. Yeah, I mean, that's correct because the legal requirement is to complete the flight review every 24 calendar months. But the FAA decided to do away with that wording and call it flight review because it is better to fly with an instructor even more often, maybe every 12 months to stay proficient. It's easy to lose the skill. You know, when you're flying around, you're probably just thinking, oh my God, this is so fun. You're not thinking about ADM. You're not thinking about all that stuff. So it's important to fly with an instructor every so often just to make sure you're up to date on the information. You can still proficiently operate your airplane. And lastly, I know I've said this a couple of times, but the key thing is remember that a flight review is not a check ride or a test. A flight review is not a check ride or a test. You are expected, you know, try your best, come in with the information prepared, know your stuff, know how to fly your airplane, but you're not expected to have every single little thing down or perfect, just like, you know, you're preparing for a check ride. Just kind of think of it as two pilots, one's a little more experienced, maybe talking and catching up to make sure you know what you're doing still and can still, you know, fly an airplane safely, just kind of have fun with it there. All right, so that brings me to the end of the material. So if anybody has any questions, we can do that now.
Wesley, do CFIs ever get flight reviews?
That is a good question. So again, we still have that requirement. If I don't get a new rating in the next 24 calendar months, or I don't do one of those wings phases, yeah, I would still have to get that flight review.
Would it have to be done by another CFI with the same rating as you, or do they have to have a higher rating?
Any CFI can do it.
So Wesley, back on the type ratings, you said, you know, let's say you have a tail wheel endorsement and obviously a regular, you know, Cessna, whatever. Mm-hmm. If you do a flight review just in the non-tail wheel, that covers everything?
Yeah, it's kind of weird that it does cover everything. You can do it in anything you're rated for. I mean, is it a good idea to still fly with another instructor in that other aircraft? Sure. I mean, definitely it would be good to stay proficient, but legally the requirement is if you are rated in multiple kinds of aircraft, you can do the flight review in one of them and it'll count for everything else.
Okay. And then what if you're instrument rated? What goes on there?
All right, so another good point. So we have kind of a parallel for instrument. We call that an instrument proficiency check. So that's IPC. Trying to think. I've never had to do one before because I can stay current with my approaches, but it's similar, but there's a shorter time span where we have to do approaches and whatnot. So similar concept. Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, so Anita has a question, I think it's in the chat here. If you haven't done one for a vast number of years, is it still possible to do a BFR? Definitely. A lot of people get their certificate and get back to normal life. They don't fly for 15, 20 years and they come back and say, all right, I have a private, but I don't remember anything at all. So let's do this again. So you just fly with the instructor again, develop a course of action, work on the things you need to work on to get you to pass the BFR. You take the BFR and that's it. So it definitely is possible to do that. No problem.
All right, does anyone else have any other questions here? Can you hear me, Wesley?
Yeah, I gotcha.
That was great. That was it was really informational. Thank you.
Good, glad to hear.
I think that's all we've got. If you have any suggestions or questions in terms of ideas for future webinars, always let us know. This will be posted so you can come back and rewatch it. And I think that's it. Anything else, Wesley?
That's it as well. Yeah, I think just if you guys have any other suggestions of what you want to see, email the airport and we'll make it happen.
Yeah. Yeah. As you see, Wesley does a very nice detailed explanation and breaks it down really clearly. So that's it. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wesley.
Thanks, Wesley.
Thanks for including me still. It's always useful.
You're welcome. Oh, and Wesley, I like the new background. It looks great. No longer with the DC3.
Yeah, you know what happened? Because my laptop died, so I just got a new one like 2 days ago, so I couldn't find that old picture, so I had to do this. Yeah.
No, this is a good one, though.
Yeah, and I found that on Google. It was it's not bad at all. So, yeah.
Oh, I thought you took the photo. I was impressed. All right. Have a good night, everyone. Andrew, we'll see you soon for that check ride.
Yeah, hopefully when the weather cooperates.
Yes.
Seriously.
Next couple of days, probably not, but hopefully soon.
All right. Take care.
Fingers crossed. See you all soon. Have a good night.
Take
Bye.
care.